Good evening, and welcome to the Baylor University Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month Waco Leadership Panel. My name is Quavis Peacock, and I'm privileged to serve here at Baylor in the Office of External Affairs, where I serve as the Assistant Director for Cultural Wealth. Through my role, I hope to create connection between the Baylor campus and the Waco community in ways that particularly promote our strong cultural diversity. With this leadership panel, we hope to kind of dive into that connection, hearing from those who are making great strides within their own particular place of profession or within their community. They just so happen to be, and proudly so, of Asian descent. To support us in this effort, we'll be joined today by Senior International Studies and Spanish major, Christine Font. Christine serves as the Multicultural Affairs intern for the Coalition of Asian Students. Through this role, this evening, she will be able to serve in a leadership space, moderating a panel of highly esteemed guests. We are excited to have her. We are excited for you to join us this evening. We are excited to hear more from our local leaders of Asian descent. Christine, I turn over to you.
Hi, Quavis. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I am so proud to be able to introduce our panelists for this evening and to be able to moderate this wonderful event. So just to get started with our show for tonight, I'm going to introduce Jamie Wong Baeza. So she is the artist and founder of Designs with Jamie. She is a middle school math teacher by day and artist by night. She started Designs with Jamie in the middle of 2020 with the model "No Value, Bestow Value." Whether she's creating digital illustrations, painting with acrylics, or installing a mural, she focuses on communicating a positive, encouraging message to remind people of their true identities. Her current project is creating a Waco coloring book to highlight the diverse voices and businesses in the Waco community. So let's welcome Jamie Wong Baeza. Next, we have Jaja Chen. Jaja is a licensed clinical worker, social worker, and supervisor in the private practice specializing in trauma, racial trauma, EMDR therapy, perinatal mental health, and burnout. Jaja is also a co-worker and chief of strategic initiatives and business partnerships of CHA Community, formerly named Waco Cha, which is a boba tea company based in Waco, Texas, with a mission of bridging cultures and creating community. Jaja's joys in life include thrifting, including enjoying afternoon tea, practicing yoga and swimming, and playing with her English bulldog, Momo. Next, we have Amy Gaston, my apologies, Amy Gaston. She currently spends her time as the Director of Local Marketing Initiative and Events at Magnolia. In that role, she oversees the strategy and execution of foot traffic initiatives to all Magnolia entities here in Waco and oversees the events team and the vacation rentals team, managing the 4 rental properties this company holds across the city. Amy spends her professional career in sports and education, first as an English teacher in South Korea, then as a high school volleyball coach and teacher before earning her master's in management at Baylor. She interned for the Baylor Athletic Department before taking a job with the University of North Texas Mean Green. And she and her husband, Josh, recently purchased a home and are proud to call the Waco community their own. And last but not least, we have Sam Lin. Samuel Lin is currently a senior event coordinator at Riot Games. He graduated from Baylor in 2019 and worked in 2 Waco businesses for over 2 years after that, the Waco Escape Rooms and Nexus Esports. He served on the officer board at KSA, which is known as the Korean Student Association at Baylor, for 3 years and interned at the Department of Multicultural Affairs, representing the Asian community on campus. And he says that he loves video games and enjoys them regularly, including League of Legends, Valorant, TFT, Apex Legends, anything that's not single player. And outside of esports, he enjoys photography, longboarding on the beach, sports, and is also a big, big foodie. So now that we have all of our panelists introduced, I'm excited to have them answer some of the questions that we've prepared for tonight. But before we get into our panel, I would like to remind our participants, our spectators, that we do have a Q&A session at the end of our time, and you are welcome to put your questions in the Q&A chat box, and I will regularly go through them to share them with our panelists. So the first question is sort of an easy one, but let's start with, how do you handle burnout? Seeing that Jaja also specializes in burnout trauma therapy, we can start with Jaja.
Cool. So I think, for me, learning how to handle burnout came from experiencing a season of immense burnout from previous work settings. And so for me, I found that I have to schedule in times to take care of myself, or else it's just not going to happen. And so if it's not on the schedule, it's not going to happen. And so then that means setting a time to exercise, even things like scheduling time off, since I am self-employed. And then, ensuring that there's strong boundaries between work and life is huge for me, because, I can just, if I didn't do that, I would just keep working probably. And so that just like very clear on my end of, when work stops and the parameters for even things like use of social media and all of that, since I do use that a lot for work purposes.
To add on to that, I also have to schedule in my times just to refresh myself. And for me, what really helps with burnout is re-envisioning myself for whatever it is I am a part of. So whether that's for my teaching job, I have to really remind myself that I'm there for the students, that it's all about my relationships with them. And then in my art career, it's re-envisioning myself of, why am I creating these pieces? Who am I hoping to impact and educate through it? And then also doing the hard work of deciding if there's something that I'm doing that is not fitting into my vision. Those are things that I need to cut out. So it's really easy to get sucked into doing a lot of really good things and things that are fun or helpful or beneficial to my career or things like that. But if it's not at the core of the why I'm doing those things, sometimes I just have to kind of make those hard decisions and choose what's most important and prioritize.
Yeah, I feel like I need to take notes from Jaja and Jamie, because Lordy, I am not the expert in the burnout, avoiding the burnout culture, but I think that the things that they spoke to is just finding time. I'm really fortunate to have leadership that I report to that values that and recognizes in me when I'm near burnout, because I don't have an off switch, as probably most of you in this group can attest to. But yeah, I think just being intentional about that. I loved what Jamie said about finding a way to say no to things that don't speak to the core of who we are. I think as a person who inherently wants to please and inherently wants to, be the best at what I do, it's hard for me to recognize that. But I think in my 30s, I've really tried to embrace those moments to walk away. In fact, before this call, I was scheduling blocks of time through my day just to do work that isn't a meeting. And so that I can then find time to, see my husband, see friends after school or after work and things. So yeah, I think intentionality is the key to avoiding burnout.
Yeah, just to tag on to like everything that you guys are saying, like pretty similar. Like all of us probably have been grinding multiple times, hours on weeks, and just like no stop, honestly. And I know for me, it's like that's a mentality that I love having. Like I love staying busy, but I also understand that like, yeah, burnout just creeps up on you randomly, and like, yeah, you're like going with the flow, and then bam, you just get hit with burnout. And so yeah, like definitely I've agree with what Amy just said. I'm taking a lot of notes now as well, because it's just like I think I have random times, and I'm like grateful for like the company I work at now that like schedules time post events that you work on. It's like you are forced to have time off, like no questions asked, basically, and that's like super cool to see. But it's also kind of like a realistic expectation, like, oh, these like 60-hour weeks you're working, like you just gotta make it through, and then you'll like have that week off. And I think it's stuff that they learned and stuff that I learned recently as well, after working these like long hours and just continuing doing it with no weeks off. It's like, oh, maybe if I spent those times like during school or like just right after school when I started working, maybe if I had like a week or two off more so scheduled within my time, I wouldn't have felt as much pressure as I did. So yeah, but like you guys basically covered all of that.
So it sounds like setting boundaries and re-envisioning yourself at the core of what you do and sticking to those core values seems like a common trend between handling burnout. And I ask this question because as Baylor students and also being a student leader, burnout is something that we don't always talk about. And oftentimes we don't even recognize that we are burnt out until it's too late, until we're failing classes, until we're stressed out. And so I'm glad that you're able to offer some advice to our Baylor students on how to better manage our mental health and how to better manage our time. Another issue that Baylor students go through, or specifically, I want to switch gears to this, but second generation Americans and international students experience homesickness. And I want to ask if this is something that you experience, given that we all live in Waco. How do you combat homesickness and feel, I guess, more culturally satiated or connected to your culture? And do you have any advice to our Baylor students who may be experiencing cultural homesickness?
Yeah, so
oh, sorry, Jamie, go right ahead.
You're good. So I actually moved from Taiwan to Baylor as a college student. So that culture shock was very jarring. It was a huge transition for me. And now I've been living in Waco for 8 years, but it's still something that I miss all the time, missing home, missing family, missing familiar foods and people and cultures and the language, all of those things. So if you are out there experiencing that, I'm with you. But I think to combat those things, one obvious answer is really to surround yourself with community, and specifically community that understands, to have those safe people who know your whole story and accept you and love you for who you are. And then you can share those things with them. So finding friends and people to share the aspects I miss most about Taiwan with, and also finding the spaces here in Waco where you can build those relationships. So of course, one of my favorite spots is Cha Community, always there to get boba. I was addicted to boba back in Taiwan, still am here. East Market and Goods, just walking up and down the aisles always make me feel at home. And so I think finding those spaces and then also the people that you can fully be yourself with are really important.
Yeah, and I would add to that just what I mean, I feel like I'm going to be a broken record, but just intentionality in that, right? Community doesn't just happen. I think it happens a little easier in the college level because you're like surrounded by people all the time and you're living with these people and going to class. But when you become an adult, intentionality, relationships, and community is really vital to sustaining that. I love people and I want to be around people all the time, but you find as you get older, that gets tougher and tougher because life happens. You have a family, you have kids. I don't, but you have all the things, your friends have kids, and it's just harder to do that. And so I think just being purposeful in that and knowing that sometimes it takes a little work. It takes work to combat homesickness. It's really easy to sit in your dorm room and soul can be sad. I think the opposite side, when I spent a year in South Korea, I wasn't homesick at all until Thanksgiving, and all I really wanted was pumpkin pie, which sounds really crazy. But the worst thing I could have done was sit and sulk and to be sad in the moment. And I was thankful for a community of other, American teachers who were in that space, who were living that. And so I was thankful for that. But yeah, I would say intentionality is key to combating homesickness.
Yeah, I'll add to what all of y'all are talking about. I think part of why we created Cha Community was because of that very longing for connection, being second generation Asian American, and my husband Devin being an immigrant, and myself having been overseas and lived there in China and Taiwan prior to coming to Baylor. So I think, other than connecting with fellow folks or even fellow, Asian Americans or third culture kids or folks like international students who can understand your background and culture, if there isn't spaces there for you, start to create those spaces, which I know it was really hard. I think for me, I've always sometimes it can be discouraging on the low days, on the days that's like, oh, why does it always have to be us that's the one that's creating these spaces for Asian Americans here in Waco? But I think it's when we meet in person or when we gather online or even things like this that I'm like, okay, it's worth it. What Jamie was saying, right? The idea of the why, right? The why that connects to our values. It's like in these gatherings is when it becomes worth it, because the moments of sacrifice then makes it worth it to create, right, the spaces that aren't there. And so I think for me in this season, something that's really helped with homesickness, since I can't actually travel to visit family or visit places like larger cities that has more Asian Americans, or can't go as often as I used to in the past because of the pandemic, I actually joined a group called Agile, which is an Asian American Justice Innovative Lab nonprofit based in LA. And so we meet every 2 weeks to support each other when it comes to racial justice and community work. And so that's been huge. So I think finding support, even if it means an online space, that might not necessarily be Waco based, but whatever support you need to be able to continue thriving is huge.
Yeah, like lastly, I'll just add, because I recently moved out to LA actually, so it's actually a cool thing you mentioned that, because now I'm gonna go check it out as well, because that place is very cool. As well as like Yellow Chair Collective, I believe, also spoke at Baylor recently as well, and they're like an incredible group, also based out of LA. So there's like a lot of initiatives that are out here, and it's like really cool to see Waco itself like growing. Like I recently, I think 3 weeks ago, just like stopped by, just to see like what was happening, just because it's been a little bit since I've been back in town. And I can like clearly remember like just times in college where I'm just like, I don't feel any like sort of like my cultural community like here. Like obviously maybe it's because I like intentionally went out of my way to start other clubs, or I went and joined clubs that are just like a different like culture, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Every club on campus I've been a part of has been super welcoming. The communities are always super great. If you have not joined a club, definitely you should be doing that. But yeah, like what we're doing here on campus and what Christine's continued to do like after I left as well, and like even Lauren in between both of us, the initiatives that we've had that kept growing. I know for a fact that like when Yoonki started this whole coalition, that he had this huge vision in mind about just like growing the community here, especially representation on campus. And I mean, you can clearly see like Waco's growing in the Asian American population, in the Asian population in general, especially like successes like East Market and Shaw community as well. Like I wish I like knew about these things / had these things like when I was in college, and it's like post college. I'm like, wow, these like communities are super great. They're like super fundamental, honestly, to combat this homesickness. And yeah, it's just repeating what everyone else has been saying, just joining the communities, being intentional. You guys have really great resources now. Just keep using them and start your own if you don't have them.
Thank you, everyone, for commenting on that question. Something that is really personal to me as an Asian Baylor student. As you know, I live 4 hours away, and so sometimes it's not as easy to get the foods that you want. And I'm grateful for East Market actually for becoming Waco's first Asian grocery store, so that I can find the cultural ingredients that I need. And I've just noticed that we have some Baylor alumni as part of our panelists. Can y'all comment on if y'all have felt ever culturally homesick on Baylor's campus at your time here as a student?
I was like, I don't know who wants to start. I could technically start. As like, I think, yeah, I graduated about 2 years back. So it's not still pretty fresh out of everything. Definitely felt a lot. Throwing that out there. Baylor isn't necessarily, at least, and I know it's gotten a lot better, and it's probably been like better now than it was back then. And I'm acting like back then was like 2 years ago, and it's like, wow, it's so long ago. And so I'm sure like everyone else here probably has like a different story, but like back then for me, like even those like 4 years of my time there, and then the 2 years post living in Waco, there's been a lot has happened on campus, especially during when I was doing the internship or even post internship. The amount of people that would just say things or just do stuff that just seemed normal to them. And for me, I was like, is that, you'd really just say that? And so it's like, I think for me that this happened a lot, and I can't tell if it's just a Baylor thing and a thing that can definitely be changed on campus, and it'd be like a cultural change on campus, or maybe that's like a Southern Texas thing. And not saying that like it's gonna engulf all of Southern Texas, like everyone's like that. I'm sure most people have been super friendly and super nice. But yeah, it definitely has happened a lot. And yeah.
I think my experience is probably a little different. I came to Baylor as a grad student. I was 30. I grew up in a really small West Texas panhandle town, and we were the only Asian family for a very, very long time. So my experience of that was very different. I actually found the opposite when I came to Baylor. I remember being in a building and looking up, and on a whiteboard, somebody had clearly like been taking Hangul lessons, something. There was like Hangul like written across all of these boards, and in my heart just swelled, because that is not what I got to grow up with. I was literally, I was the Chinese kid, and I'm not Chinese at all. And so growing up, and so I felt the opposite of that. And Samuel, I hate that you experienced what you did, and but that wasn't my experience at Baylor. I actually was really, really pleased with kind of the cultural embrace that I found in that space. But again, I wasn't 18, I was 30 on a campus that I didn't live on, and I wasn't dealing with other 18-year-old kids in that space. So I actually found it to be quite opposite.
Yeah, I think my experience is a bit different too, because, well, I think part of it being having been a third culture kid, it's actually, I look back and I'm like, wow, I probably was kind of standoffish, because I kind of disassociated from Asian Americans and only spent time with international students or other third culture kids, and was just kind of like, I'm not Asian American, little 18-year-old me, just like not wanting to identify as Asian American. I'm like, I'm Chinese, I'm Taiwanese, I'm not Asian American, which is funny, right? But I look back. So I think because of that, my undergrad experience was filled with a lot of multicultural experiences. So I surrounded myself mostly with folks who had been international. And so I had a pretty positive experience, I think, from that standpoint. But I think it was towards the later part, once graduating, moving into grad school, and then at that point, studying social work is in downtown Waco. And so just disconnecting from Big Baylor, and moving more into the community is really where the challenge was, of the loneliness or homesickness, or feeling like, wow, okay, I'm the only Asian or only minority everywhere I go.
Yeah, I think my experience was just a mix of all of yours. I graduated 4 years ago, yes. And during that time, I would say the first year is definitely the hardest. So if you're a freshman out there, fear not, it will get better. And I think, there's a lot of transition all across the board, regardless of where you're coming from. But after that year, going back to that piece where Amy was talking about, it just takes a lot of intentionality. If you want to surround yourself with people who remind you of home, like, there are people, it might not be the majority, but there are plenty of opportunities out there. So I had a foot in international student ministry at my church. And then I also was a part of AMIV while I was at Baylor. I took like a Korean class, and just ended up like living with different Asians across my time in different apartments and things like that. So I think it just took some time to find those people, but there are plenty out there. And so there's a community for everyone, regardless of where on the spectrum you are. And so if you're currently going through feelings of homesickness or loneliness, don't give up. Just keep looking, because you will find your people. And every year of college just got better. So.
I'm glad to hear y'all comment on that. I know this is something that our that our students, experience, and it's an initiative that we've started to try to combat here at Baylor, especially at my time as interning for the Department of Multicultural Affairs. And so I'm happy to continue Sam's work, and I'm also happy to hear y'all say that it has to be an intentional work to find these communities and to find people in these places. And the shout out for Chalk Community for creating that space for us. And it certainly won't be the last place or the only place where we can find community. I want to move on to this next question. And it's, and if you have experience with this, comment on it, and if not, that's fine too. But how does your identity function in larger cities where there is a densely populated Asian community versus in small rural town cities where there's a sparser population of Asian, South Asian, Asian Americans?
Yeah, I can speak to this. Again, I kind of spoke to this earlier. I grew up in a town of 7,000 people. I lived in Korea on a military base till I was 8 and went to international schools with kids that were half this, part this, spoke 3 languages. The way we blended and became friends was we would share language, right? So you would teach me words in Mandarin and I would teach you words in Korean, and maybe you were, Vietnamese or you were from South Africa. Like there were just this blending. And then my dad retired from the military and dropped me in this very tiny Panhandle town in Texas. And I was the only kid in my 3rd grade class who was different and who hadn't been there since preschool. And I distinctly remember sitting next to Michelle Montoya. We ended up playing basketball together growing up, but that name, right? She sounds Hispanic, Mexican. And so I go to as an 8-year-old, I say to her, "I'm Amy, it's so nice to meet you. Do you mind teaching me some Spanish and I'll teach you some Korean?" And I distinctly remember her looking at me and she said, "I don't speak Spanish." And I remember in that moment thinking, did I misinterpret your nationality, which then embarrassed me. So that was my beginning of this understanding that oh, I live somewhere very, very different. And I live in a community that doesn't understand anything that I've experienced as an 8-year-old to this point in my life. I live in a community that doesn't understand my mother. I live in a community where nobody looks like us, and the closest Asian market is Dallas or Oklahoma City, and we were 6 hours from each. And so it began this journey of really this almost like this shame in hiding who I was and hiding my Asian culture for that. And it wasn't until I was able to live in the metropolitan area in college and experience that I thought, okay, I can be different. And hey, I'm not so different because there's lots of people that look just like me. And so I really had to come into my adulthood. And it wasn't until I was living in a community that looked like I looked and had experienced the things that I had experienced. And so certainly I think it's much easier it's almost like this opposite of being able to blend in a big city and find some community in that and become a part of the norm, as opposed to really being forced to stand out in a small rural space. I was very thankful that I lived in a community that embraced me in spite of being different. But I think I had to sacrifice who I was in order to do that. I had to not be the different kid. I had to assimilate into this very rural culture. I played sports as a savior that saved me from being the weird kid. And I was very thankful for that. But that's not everyone can do that. I think maybe many of you have lived in a community, small communities, maybe you're 2nd generation, 3rd generation Asian American student who came from a rural community who still doesn't get you. And maybe sports or whatever was cool in that population wasn't easy for you to be a part of. And but certainly larger communities and being a part of that, being a part of a culture, again, at Baylor, being able to look around and see other Asian American students and thinking, yeah, I didn't get to do this. I didn't get to go to school with Asian American kids. And so, I think it's certainly easier, but I think there's a great growth that can happen in that space if you just hold on. So my encouragement to whoever's out there, hold on, it does get better, but it does take intentionality and work. But I don't know if that answered the question. I'm sorry. I think I trailed off.
No, that's perfect, Amy. I'm glad you said that. There's great growth to happen in these spaces, but it takes work. And I think it's very encouraging for a lot of us Baylor students who may come from like Los Angeles or Orange County, where there's just like this large population of Asian students who feel very comfortable in their identity, and then they come to Baylor, where it's a lot more rural, and you're like, oh my gosh, who am I? Like, am I Asian enough? Like, is this what Asian looks like, or am I the foreigner? And so I'm glad you're able to comment on that. Yes.
I'll say, if I don't mind adding to it, just because I moved from Waco to LA. That's kind of the most jarring difference between the two I think I've ever seen. Because I grew up in Arizona, predominantly Caucasian community there. But I also went to like a Christian Asian church. That's what I grew up with. So it's like on the weekends I have like my Asian friends, and on like the weekdays I have like my Caucasian friends and friends of other races. And so for me, like that was very similar to when I went to campus on Baylor. And like the big difference that I can see between just being at campus and then now being in a city that has probably one of the largest Asian American populations in the country, is like the biggest one I can see is like, while I'm here, I feel like I fit in. While I was on campus, I feel like I didn't fit in, but I don't necessarily take that as like a bad thing. I think for me, it was like, oh, I didn't fit in on campus. Well, I'm sure other people feel this way. How can I make it so that we start fitting in? And like for me, that was like a lot of motivation to do the work that I was doing that was on campus, or create spaces that weren't created. And I know that's like, it takes, again, like the intentionality, and that takes a lot of effort, making friends with like administration, talking administration every day, working on your own projects as well as your homework, and then you have to study for tests, and then you have school stuff, and it's like it takes a lot of like extra time. But Baylor has been pretty good about, yeah, we don't have all the spaces. They acknowledge that they don't have every space available, but they have the resources that if people want to make those spaces, you can make them happen. Like I started an esports club on campus within a year, and it's just like a random idea, and it's like, oh, we can do it now. It's like, let's just go for it and do it. Just talk to the right people, put in amount of effort in. It's like 10 hours a week extra, or just putting it into this club. And yeah, it grows. Like the 10 hours you put in, you get 20 hours back of like happiness, honestly. And so that, I think that's the biggest difference, is like, while I've been here for these past, I've only been here for like 5-6 months, but even being here for only 5-6 months, I feel like there's so much less I feel like I can do, because the city is so much bigger, and I feel like there's so many things that already happened. And so for me, it's like, oh, what can I learn from this? And on the contrary, when you're in a small rural town and none of these big things have happened yet, it's like, how can I start these big things, right? So I can become this big, basically this big namesake in this big community for the smaller town. And I guess that's like the biggest difference I've seen. It's like, one, kind of like bouncing off what Amy said, it's like, one, you feel like you're fitting in. And that's not necessarily bad. I know those come with negative connotations, but when you're fitting in and you're learning from other people who have established it, and the other one, you're growing a community and you're building it yourself. And so it's just however you feel. If you feel like Baylor impacts you, right? So Baylor feels like it fits in, just keep learning from around you. Baylor feels like it's not home yet, it's like, you can make it home. Just, yeah.
I love that distinction, Samuel, because I feel like, oftentimes being in a rural town or smaller community where there's less Asian Americans or Asian population, though the weakness becomes, the smaller demographic, it does become an opportunity for folks to pioneer in new areas. I mean, even within, I'm just like thinking about business too, like it becomes a new business opportunity, as well as just opportunities for new connection to be made. So like for you, for starting new clubs that wasn't there, right? I know for a lot of folks who are Asian American friends of mine who live in larger cities, they do feel like sometimes it can be harder to be able to find their place in a larger city, because of just how, just the fact that it is larger size demographic wise, but also even just feeling more pressure even to feel like, okay, I have to like get it all right, or it has to be like soup, like, not that we don't want to strive for premium or like high quality, but the I think the higher pressures even of perfectionism can be seen a lot more in larger cities, for all sorts of reasons. For me, I lived in China and Taiwan, but then prior to that, I was in Norman, Oklahoma. And so it was pretty big shift between being in, majority white school, only Asian or Asian American usually in the neighborhood or in the school, to then moving to China and Taiwan where, everybody looks like me. And then it's when I speak in Mandarin or Chinese that they would then be like, we don't know where to put you. Your accent sounds different. Well, in China, they would think I'm Taiwanese. In Taiwan, they'd be like, okay, you must be like a ABC, or we don't really know what you are. And so so I think that experience from an early age taught me that I don't really belong anywhere. And so I gave up trying to find that. And so coming to Waco was then another culture shock of being once again kind of in a majority white context, but then not having had the cultural background similar to Norman, where I grew up with the kids or grew up with everybody, my whole life. So I think being in Waco was actually the hardest out of all those different places I moved. But the experience of being different, I think, is what propelled me and fueled me to want something different for myself and also for future generations. So it became a motivation as well.
Jaja, I think it's interesting that you talk about not feeling like you belong. I'm not going to lie, in full transparency, I feel a little out of water with this incredible panel that's here. I am half Korean and my dad is a 6'5" white American man. And so English is my first language, even though I was born overseas. It is in a big city, it's easy for me to be American, quote unquote. When I lived in South Korea as an adult, I'm 6 feet tall, and my boyfriend at the time, now husband, used to laugh because he's like, if I ever lost Amy in a crowd, I could find her because she's like a head taller than everybody else in the crowd, even though she has dark hair. So in Korea, I was very much an American, very easy to identify as an American. I'm thankful that my Korean accent didn't give me away in Jaja's experience there. But it's interesting, right, to feel like you don't quite fit in the space. I'm super honored to be asked to be on this panel, but in full transparency, when I read your questions, Christine, I was like, oh, I don't know if that was my experience as a student or as a child or as an adult. But to feel this like strange mix of like, I am Asian American, but I am an American. Like I literally grew up riding horses and barrel racing and, things that are maybe a little outside of everyone else's world. I think it's been an interesting piece. Jaja, you said Waco's been the hardest place. I think Waco for me has been the easiest place because it is a community, it feels like, of people that are just different, and maybe it's because I've had the privilege of meeting people like Jaja or working in a place like Magnolia where there's a lot of women specifically that look like me. It has felt the most like home of all the places that we've lived. And I feel the least amount of I'm different than I've ever felt probably in my entire adult life, certainly of my adolescence.
I'm glad you brought that up, Amy. And it's a great segue into our next question, onto the theme of like bicultural identity. So we know that there is no singular wave of Asian migration, and migration patterns have created fifth generation Asian Americans to newly arrived immigrants that we commonly refer to as fresh off the boat or fresh off the plane. And so we know that the Asian identity is not a monolith. And so with this, like, what has been your personal experience? How do you find the balance in your own identity? And is there a point where it does get better and you're able to celebrate both identities without like being Asian and American? Or have you ever felt any shame externally from your peers or internally from yourself because you either prefer your American identity or you prefer American traditions over Asian ones, and vice versa? And I ask this question because as college students, like many of us are at a place in our lives developmentally where we do go through a ton of like internal identity pressures where we're trying to find our group in life. And so I want to ask if you had any advice for this as you are a bit older and maybe you've gone through these college years. If you wanted to go first, Amy, I know you brought up just
Cool. Yeah, I'm happy. I think I could talk for days on it. I think it was just such a journey. I remember distinctly being a freshman in college, and I had a friend who attended Texas Tech working in social work, and she was taking a multicultural class. And the assignment was to interview someone who they personally knew who was of a different cultural descent. And my best friend, I mean, we've been best friends since we were 10. And she said it took her a week to identify me as somebody from a different culture. And I remember that really sticking with me, thinking, I really have assimilated. My mother is Korean, like full Korean with the accent, all the culture. I mean, Korean, give her all the kimchi in the world. Like, she is Korean, and that is what I grew up in. But I had spent, like I said earlier, most of my adolescence shoving that identity down. I didn't want to be different. I didn't want to be the Korean kid. I colored my hair lighter brown instead of just this dark hair that I have. I just didn't want to be it. And it was in that moment as a freshman in college that I realized, like, I had so assimilated that even the people that were closest to me didn't identify me in that space. And I felt shame. I really did. I thought, what have I done here? And so I slowly began this journey of like, what does it look like to balance that? What does it look like to do both? And my time in Korea teaching, I think, really helped me embrace a culture that I had forgotten, quote unquote. I mean, we didn't live there, so, and really embracing that again. But I think that for me, I just had to be okay with being not like everyone. I love that you said that it's not monolithic, right? It doesn't look the same. Just because I'm half Korean and half, Caucasian doesn't mean that any other half Korean, half Caucasian woman I meet is going to look like me or have the same story as me or have the same experience as me. And that's okay. Being different, being exactly who I am, and loving Korean food, but loving, and loving Chinese New Year and loving celebrating those things, and Chuseok and all those things, but also loving pumpkin pie and Thanksgiving and the things that make me American and American football and all of that. Like, I think there's something beautiful in the uniqueness of what being an Asian American looks like to me. And it has taken a long time. I'm 36. It has taken a very long time to become okay with that and be okay with walking into a Korean market and being able to order something in Korean or to ask a merchant for something in Korean, and for them to pause and be like, and not really understand. I used to be really embarrassed by that, but I have just come to learn that there is great beauty in that. And I'm thankful for a community of people who have surrounded me to tell me, and who continue to be curious about my culture, to be curious about my background, to be curious about this mix of weird, small West Texas town and Korean background in together. And so, yeah, it's definitely not been a straight line. And I'm ashamed to say that, like, I really did. I really had to come to, what does being Asian American look like to me?
I think for me, my experience was pretty stark, I guess. I don't know, but when I was really little, like 6 or 7, I had a conversation with my sister, and we were talking about, I don't even know, but our heritage or something. And my sister was saying, like, you are Chinese. And I was like, no, I'm not. Like, I am not Chinese. I'm American. She's like, no, you are a Chinese little girl. And I was like, no, I'm American. Because to me, as a little 6, 7-year-old, my brain could not like differentiate the ideas of being Asian American together. And really the issue there was that I was associating American with Caucasian. Because to me, like, I just thought, like, in order to be American, you had to be a certain race and you couldn't be from a different ethnicity. And like, I think that's one of the things that we have to be really careful about, is not to see Asian and American as mutually exclusive things. I think a lot of things in the culture point to like an American identity as being things that have been really influenced by whiteness throughout history. For better or for worse. But now, like, I think we are living in this really unique and important time where that piece of being American is being reshaped and transformed by the diverse people who live in this country and who claim this as their nationality. And so I just think, yeah, it's important to see that these things aren't exclusive from each other, and that we are the people who bridge the gap and can fully claim and correct people when they're wrong, and extend grace towards ourselves and towards others. But just to be like, no, I can fully enjoy the Asian side of my heritage and the American side, and there's nothing that says I can't be both. So
I'm gonna go ahead and comment. I, really enjoy y'all's answers because it gives me a sense of peace in my own identity. I also experience a lot of turmoil within my own personal identities, and I know that whenever I am in a community or when I'm in a space that has, you know, Vietnamese students, Vietnamese international students, I feel like I'm not Vietnamese enough because I'm not as fluent in the language, or I don't know these like inside jokes. And so it gets to a point where you ask, like, am I Vietnamese enough? Like, am I Asian enough? And it's something that has impacted my development identity stages, like growing up, because it really pulls at you. But it's great to hear, Amy, you say that it gets better. You have to come to terms with what really is the Asian American identity, and it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. You can be both Asian and American, and the fact that American is being what is American is being reshaped and by different voices, different diverse voices, and so there's clarity and profoundness in that. So thank you for your comments. I want to remind our participants and spectators that we still have time to submit your questions and to go over your questions. So please utilize the Q&A box so that we can go over some of y'all's questions at the end. Don't be shy, ask away. So I want to move on to this, theme of the concept of a culture vulture. And so I'm just gonna go off on this. So according to Cambridge Dictionary, the phrase culture vulture means someone who is very interested in art, music, theater, and this is in the most positive sense of this phrase. But according to Urban Dictionary, in the most negative sense of this phrase, it means a person or a practitioner of cultural appropriation, an inauthentic individual who attempts to identify with other aspects of culture and claim it as their own. So how would you primarily describe the communities that you interact with? Do you consider their curiosity and their interest in your culture as genuine, or do you think it comes from a place of like superficial acceptance, or almost like a form of fetishization or exoticism? But yeah, let's go with that first.
I can go first. I love this question, Christine, because I can go on and on and on. And I won't go on and on, but about cultural appropriation, because it shows up so much in the food and beverage industry. But I would start off with saying, cultural appreciation, I think, is where all the people that I've interacted with when it comes to our guests at CHOC Community, majority, especially all the guests that really are, passionate about the idea of bridging cultures, I think connects into that value. And I would say appreciation is, you're really seeking to do the work to build awareness about other cultures different from yourself. You're really, doing education to learn more, seeking to create the connections, relationships, and to move in a commitment, right, to learn more about that culture. Appropriation, on the other hand, is where individuals or groups or organizations, businesses are profiting off of other cultures or taking from other cultures and not giving credit or attribution where it needs to be given, right? And so you see it a lot, especially in like restaurant, food and beverage industry, if folks are doing things like with matcha or with chai or with tea or with whatever cultural foods, fill in the blank, right? And then not ever giving reference to the culture and then seeking to make it like quote unquote better, or where they will market it as like, oh, we're making fill in the blank food like better, but then never even mentioning that like, oh wow, this food is from China or Taiwan or Thailand or wherever the culture is connected to that food, right? And so then what happens then, right? I think in the past people would maybe just dismiss it or whatever, but nowadays I think more and more awareness is grown that like, wow, this is actual racism and microaggression, and it's not okay to do that. And so I think there's more and more with social media, right? More and more awareness and even accountability given, to folks who are engaging in cultural appropriation.
I think Jaja just mic dropped us. That was a great answer, Jaja.
Yes, thank you. I bring up that question because it's interesting to see, well, I guess just the acceptance from the Waco community when it comes to Asian-led business models. I know that Hurry Up and Walk This Way, started off in East Market, and then shortly after they had their own brick and mortar inside of Union Hall, and so it's like, to me, surprising to see how quickly these businesses, especially food and beverage businesses, get quickly accepted by the Wacoan community. If you go to the farmers market, I see Vietnams, I see Chaw community, and like you would think, following like Orientalist theories, that the majority culture might see minority culture as something that's like, oh, this is foreign, this is different, we should reject it. And seeing this phenomenon here in Waco, I see the opposite. I see a lot of acceptance, especially with Chaw community and with Hurry Up and Walk This Way, just how quickly it gets absorbed by the Wacoan community. And wanted to see if y'all had any opinions if it was different, if it came from genuine interest, or if it was just something that was on the more superficial end.
I think the people that were superficial probably would not support us. I've had suspicions that we haven't grown as quickly as we could because of how clear we are about racism and diversity. Not suspicion. I don't have any data to prove it, but like the idea of that, our growth rate on social media probably is slower because we are like pretty outspoken about these issues related to like diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, and all these other topics. So I'm guessing the people that wouldn't support these values would get deterred and wouldn't even support our business, which there are people like that in Waco, right? So it's not like there's nobody like that, that would do cultural appropriation, but I don't have any examples personally.
I think food is a very safe entry level for a lot of people. I mean, you can love boba, but not any like the Taiwanese culture behind it, or Taiwanese people, or same thing with like Hurry Up and Walk This Way. Like you can love Thai food without really caring at all about Thai culture. So I think these restaurants and these businesses are an incredible opportunity because you do get them in for the food and for those opportunities to bring them one step further into learning and actually educating them about the culture and where this comes from and why we eat these things or where it originated from. So yeah, I think there's like, I'm not downplaying at all the successes that the Asian businesses in Waco have had, and I'm super, super thankful for them. But I also know like that it's not the end, that there's still a lot of work to be done in getting people to not just accept the food, but also the people and the fullness of the culture it brings outside of what we eat and drink.
That's so good, Jamie. Yeah, I would say we will have seen shifts when we start to see more representation, right, of our community in the actual Waco community leadership and all of that.
Yeah.
I've seen on social media, especially early in the COVID days, during that summer, what was trending was the phrase was love our food as much as you love, love our people as much as you love our food. And I think that phrase stuck with me because you see a lot of, foodies out there who appreciate exotic foods, who love boba, but I wonder if they take the time to think about the hands that make that food, their voices and their identities. But looks like we have to wrap up our time since we're ending in a couple of minutes, but we do have a question from the chat. And they ask, this past year with COVID and prevalent Asian hate, how have you seen the Waco community respond to Asian representation? And how have you seen the Baylor University students respond as well?
Okay, I guess I could start. I think it's less, I guess I can't really speak too much about like this past COVID time, but definitely during my time I was doing internship stuff for multicultural affairs. We had like our own like incident that basically happened on campus, and that was like easily probably the first like publicized one. And unlucky for that group that started it and instigated it, I don't give a crap for that stuff. Like I will combat those people like head on. So unfortunate for them, they picked up the wrong person. And I think that's getting pretty prevalent nowadays, where it's not like, I think the best way to put it is I think we're tired of being pushed down to this level of like, oh, they'll just get away with it. And I think it's kind of very clear when it's happening very often now. It's like, oh, these communities are starting to not rise up, but like in the best term possible, not take it anymore. If like even these small instances happen, and I think it is healthy, right? Like it's been that point where we've been the community that's always been like the model minority, the one that every minority should try to strive to be or whatever, the one that technically people don't even count as a minority to a certain extent. I think just having that like as your background growing up, and like that's what you're just acknowledged, and it's like, oh, like I don't feel this hate, or I don't feel this, but you feel something else, right? And it's hard to like gauge that with anyone else. And just now that we're able to like spread that out more and talk about it more, and especially now with COVID and all the racism rooted that's with it and everything like that, I kind of feel bad that I wasn't actually there during this whole time, considering that I ended up having to move out, or I was in a different part of my life and different community. I've heard countless stories of like the Asian hate that does happen on campus, and the one that I've only personally experienced the one. And then beyond that, every year post, I'm pretty sure there's been multiple occasions. And so I feel really sorry for those people who had to deal with that. And I'm really grateful for people like Christine and Lauren who are standing up for that. And the communities now that are starting to stand up for that, because that did take a lot of effort to even be one of the few people to even start it. When you feel like most other communities, if they look the same as you, that just don't want to say anything. They're just fine with it. Like it's definitely not okay. Yeah, I feel like Baylor's been pretty responsive about it, more or less. Obviously, they could do a lot better, and I will keep posting as much as I can that they could do a lot better, and keep telling all the administration that I know that, hey, like you guys need to do better than this. But I think it's a start. It's definitely a start.
Yeah, it's really cool for me to see that. I mean, not cool that the pandemic and all the racism had to occur, but cool to see the organizing that occurred because of it. I think what Samuel says is so true. It's like folks are like, we're tired of this crap and tired of not being seen, right? As people of color, as folks who are impacted by racism, by these issues that, people might perceive it as like, oh, well, you're the model minority, you're not going to experience that. But it was cool because I think after a lot of the issues with the pandemic and also even locally, what I saw was a lot of fellow, BIPOC, people of color, whatever, global majority, whatever your label is, that you identify as, folks reach out to check in and to even be like, okay, how can we better organize, to help bring more representation and diversity and awareness about Asian Americans in Waco. And that's something I wanted to thank Cuevas even for the fact that you've done so much, right, to champion Asian Americans and to want to bridge that culture, using your role at Baylor, which, your work is not unnoticed. And so, yeah, I definitely think for me, seeing the organizing, even things like protests on campus amongst the Asian and Asian American students, I was there, and it just, those are the things that feel me.
Looks like we have a minute left, so I just want to thank all of our panelists for coming out tonight. Thank you so much for your time, your vulnerability, and your honesty that was shared tonight. And I think Cuevas is going to say something too, so I'll let him go ahead.
Yeah. Again, thank you, Christine. Thank you, everyone, for deciding to join us this evening. Such a wonderful panel with such great panelists. I was really impressed and really took a lot of jewels away from the conversation. I know that everyone is viewing took some jewels away as well. 3 things that stuck with me was intentionality, community matters, and that 4 things actually: community matters, tap into what's here, and what's not here, create it. You have a power to create it. And the last thing is that we are the people who bridge the gap. So I think it was Jamie that said that. And so I'm just excited to be able to hear from you all, and excited to build community with you all, and say thank you again for participating, and thank you all for joining us. With that said, everyone have a great evening. Thank you for your time.